Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar presented by the Bureau of Business Research for June 2018. This is our last webinar of the spring semester here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And the topic is going to be the Nebraska Economic Outlook for 2018 through 2020. This outlook, is produced by the Bureau of Business Research here in the College of Business and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and the Nebraska Business Forecast Council, which is a group of economists from state government, the university system, and business organizations in the state that meet twice a year to produce an economic forecast. This is our second forecast covering the period 2018 to through 2020. My name is Eric Thompson. I'm the director of the Bureau of Business Research, and I'll be presenting our outlook today. The main part of the webinar is going to be the presentation of a PowerPoint providing details about the economic outlook for Nebraska. But I do want to let you know about a few features of the webinar. You can access through your toolbar at the bottom of your screen a question and answer window. So at any time during the presentation, you can type in a question. We'll be answering questions at the end of the PowerPoint presentation, or you can wait till the end of the PowerPoint presentation and enter your question at that point. There's also a chat window that you can access with your toolbar at the bottom of the screen, and you can chat with some of the other participants in the webinar while the webinar is going. Lastly, we'll have several poll questions for our webinar participants on the economic outlook for Nebraska. So you'll get a chance to give your opinion, your answer to a particular poll question, and then a little bit later in the PowerPoint presentation, we'll see some relevant results that help us answer those two poll questions. So with that background out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and get started with our economic forecast, economic outlook for the state of Nebraska. Real brief outline here. Basically, we're going to need to talk about the U.S. economic forecast before we start talking about the Nebraska economic forecast. So Nebraska does have a somewhat specialized economy in terms of the agriculture and related sectors, in terms of insurance and transportation. However, Nebraska does have a very diverse economy, and certainly an economy that's linked with the national and international economy in terms of customers and suppliers. So it's really important to have a U.S. economic forecast before we can start to think about what the outlook will be here in Nebraska. One way I like to say it is that the U.S. economic forecast kind of sets the speed limit for Nebraska economic growth, and we need to know that speed limit before we think about what's likely to happen here and when we interpret how we're doing here in Nebraska. So let me start with that U.S. economic forecast. As always, we're going to talk about the strengths, weaknesses for the U.S. economy, and the bottom line in terms of where we think the U.S. economy is headed. So we do have a somewhat shorter group of strengths, but it's an important group of strengths that suggest good news for the U.S. economy over the next few years. Most importantly, and this has been true for the last 3 or 4 years, we now have a self-sustaining economic recovery. So we're not reliant on government stimulus or Federal Reserve Bank stimulus. Rather, the growth of real wages and the resulting increase in consumer spending should propel the economy forward. And I think in the last year or two, we have seen a big increase in business investment. I'd say business investment is now strong. That is a relatively new development, and that is also a positive for a self-sustaining economic recovery. So that's what you want to have in order to drive economic growth for the long term. There's some other positive developments. There is strong economic growth in Asia, and that's anticipated to continue. Now, 6 months ago, we would have said there was strong economic growth in Asia and in Europe. But Europe has slowed a bit, but we can still say that the Asian economies are powering forward. China, India, Indonesia, Philippines, and so forth. A lot of economic growth out there. And we had some positive policy developments in 2017. The tax reform and tax cut package that was passed in 2017 has supported economic growth. I think is part of the reason for the increase in business investment. And we've had ongoing deregulation in the economy, which has also supported business investment. So those are, I guess, a short list, but an important list of strengths for the U.S. economy. In terms of weaknesses, we do have some ongoing issues that the U.S. economy has faced really over the last 5 to 10 years and will continue to face. In particular, the aging of the workforce. So as the large baby boom cohort of the population is aging and is now either at the higher end of the workforce, your 55 to 65-year-olds or above, or are increasingly starting to retire. So we're losing a lot of skilled, experienced workers every year from the baby boom cohort, and also we're having just a lot more retirements because this large cohort is moving on to the retirement phase of their life. And so these things tend to cause slower growth in the workforce, which is a challenge for economic growth. There's also some concerns with workforce quality. There's some skills mismatches in terms of, are we creating enough information technology workers, skilled production workers for factories and construction sites? Obviously, a lot of young people are going into these fields, but are we creating enough new people to meet the demand? The other workforce challenge issue is just more related to quality. A lot of businesses report that they're having problems with applicants, that they have concerns about hiring due to poor work history, due to inability to pass a background check, and that is also an issue that the economy faces. I don't think these problems are worse in Nebraska. They may be better than in some parts of the country, but they are a challenge that we face throughout the country and also here in Nebraska. So these things tend to slow the rate of economic growth from the supply side. Also, while we had a number of beneficial policies during 2017, it's been a little bit more of a mixed picture in terms of policy in 2018 at the federal level. In particular, Congress and the President agreed to a large spending increase at the beginning of 2018. It was actually as large in magnitude as the 2017 tax cuts, so it's quite a large spending increase. So with those tax cuts, we might have expected a spending decrease of a similar magnitude of the tax cuts. Not only did we not get that, we actually got a spending increase. These things, I think, tend to make people worry that, hey, okay, taxes are lower now, but maybe they're going to be going up in the future because we're increasing our federal spending. And I think it can reduce the potency of the tax cuts. So that's maybe a negative economic development, public policy development that we've had this year. There's also been some restrictions, new trade barriers, tariffs, and so forth imposed this year. Some restrictions even on legal immigration into the U.S. Obviously, with our challenges with the workforce and slower growing workforce, limiting legal immigration could exacerbate those challenges. And then trade barriers just lead to, it's like any tax increase, it leads to distortions in the economy, and perhaps more than a tax because trade tariffs are introduced only on certain items, sometimes for political economy reasons. It can be very distorting in terms of production and economic growth. We'll comment a little bit more on the trade barriers when we get to the bottom line. There are potential increases in interest rates. I'd say, those may just be short-term interest rates by the Federal Reserve. We'll see if there's actual increases in long-run interest rates. Every time those start to rise, they pull back a little bit. We certainly have seen that cycle over the last few months. And there have been some increases in energy prices, although those seem to have capped out here. Energy price of barrel oil, gasoline has risen, but remains reasonable and moderate. So we'll see if these become challenges for the economy. Lastly, there's no plans for entitlement reform, Social Security, Medicare, or major entitlement programs. There was a report recently suggesting that the funding is facing some challenges. It might be running deficits, or the funds might run out over the next few decades. That's an issue that's out there. I think it also creates concerns with increasing taxes in the future and is negative for the current economy as a result. So there are a number of weaknesses that we face as well. But again, there was maybe a short list of positives, but it was an important list of positives. And I think the bottom line is the speed limit is pretty good. U.S. economic growth will be pretty good the next 3 years. GDP growth in the 2.5 to 3% range probably has improved a little bit in the last year or two. And now this is assuming that there's going to be no further major spending increases, and that we're going to have limited trade restrictions and immigration restrictions of the type that we've had so far. Not a major trade war, not a major change in immigration policy which limited immigration. So the things that are occurring in terms of trade and immigration are negative for economic growth, but sort of a moderate negative. And as long as those policies don't get expanded too much, I think we can have a good GDP growth between 2.5–3% per year. It won't translate as much into job growth going forward because there are limits on growth in the domestic workforce. So that's the bottom line. A good, healthy, 65, 70 mile an hour speed limit at the U.S. economy level, which gives Nebraska's economy some room to run here in our state. So let's look at that Nebraska economic forecast. Before I do that, we're ready for our first poll question. So here it is. What is the biggest challenge for Nebraska farm income in 2018? Is it falling crop and livestock prices or falling government payments, federal government payments? So please go ahead and vote. Give your opinion on that subject, and we'll provide some information a little later regarding the answer to that question. I'm going to go ahead and move on looking at the Nebraska economic forecast. We're going to look at some of our key industries in the state: agricultural production complex, transportation, insurance, but then look at some other important industries in the forecast detail. So let's start with those key industries: the agricultural production complex, transportation, and insurance. Okay, so let's go ahead, and we're about to talk about agriculture here, so let's look at the poll results. We see that 68, about 2/3 of people, or 65, about 2/3 of people said falling crop and livestock prices will be the biggest problem in 2018, and falling government payments, about 1/3 suggested that. So let's see what we find as we talk about the agricultural production cluster. This is farmers and ranchers, but also businesses that supply farmers and ranchers, whether those are implement manufacturers, co-ops, fertilizer companies. And it also includes food processors, such as ethanol plants, animal slaughtering facilities, facilities that process corn and soybeans otherwise. We do think there'll be good new opportunities in the food processing manufacturing sector in the coming year, but there'll be challenges in the rest of the agricultural production cluster. Agricultural commodities have stabilized, but they're not expected to rise. Further, especially in 2018, we expect a decline in federal support from the two main programs, the agricultural support and price loss coverage programs. The benefit level in these programs is based on a rolling average of past prices, and that goes back a set of years. And what's happened in 2018 is that rolling group of past years no longer includes 2013, a year with very high crop prices. So the rolling average has gotten much lower, which means farmers are entitled to less benefits from these support programs, and we're expecting a pretty significant $430 million drop in payments as a result. And that really is a bigger issue for farm incomes in Nebraska than commodity prices. Those have fallen over the last 3-4 years, but we expect them to be stable here in 2018. Okay, so news is, I guess, a little on the weak side in terms of the agricultural production cluster. Farmers, ranchers, those who supply them will face not a worsening environment, but kind of a stagnant environment. Falling farm incomes due to the falling federal payments, but there's perhaps some good news in the food processing sector. All right. Here is our farm income forecast. We do expect a decline here between 2017 and 2018. Again, if you ignored federal government payments, there was a small uptick in farm income, but with that $430 million loss in farm payments, farm income will fall in 2018. Afterwards, it should pick up a little bit. In fact, in 2020, we're expecting there'll be a new farm bill. Farmers will make different choices about what programs they want to be in, and we could see a good chunk of those farm support payments come back in 2020. Okay, let's look at the transportation sector. Kind of a mixed bag here. Obviously, our growing U.S. economy and growing industrial sector at the U.S. level is a positive for the transportation sector, increasing demand for trucking and rail services. Certainly, Nebraska is a good location for the transportation industry. If you look at transportation, we actually have almost 2 jobs in Nebraska for every 1 job that you see in other states around the country on sort of a per person basis. So this industry really is concentrated in Nebraska, I think in part because of our large agricultural sector and all the goods that need to be moved around, but also because we're home to Interstate 80, which is kind of a rapidly growing east-west route across the U.S. And we just have a lot of entrepreneurship in the trucking industry, especially a lot of new firm formation and growth. So we got a lot going for us, but there are some negative trends facing the industry. For rail, the decline in coal use among utilities is reducing coal shipments. For trucking, there's some labor shortages that they face in the short run, and then automation in the long run, the driverless trucks. So we're not expecting a lot of employment growth in the transportation industry, even though it's a big part of our economy. Here's the specific forecast. You can see in 2017, we had 52,700 jobs in this sector, according to the U.S. Department of Labor. We're only expecting 600 new jobs total over the next 3 years. So not a lot of growth in transportation either. Let's look at our last key industry, insurance. Again, Nebraska has some clear advantages why this industry succeeds in our state. We have a very qualified workforce. Hard to find a state, there's maybe a few others with such a large number of experienced insurance workers as you find here in Nebraska. We have specialized programs to train key workers in the industry, such as actuarial science programs. I'll put in a plug for our fine program here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in actuarial science. And we have a lot of policies that are beneficial to the insurance carrier industry here in Nebraska. The policies have been put in place to support our industry. So there is some potential for growth in insurance, although it's a very competitive industry. Now, insurance is part of financial services. That also includes banking and the people in real estate who are not self-employed. You can see we expect better growth in the financial services industry, almost 2,000 new jobs over the next 3 years. So a little bit more growth from this sector. So if you look at our 3 key sectors where we specialize in Nebraska, 2 of them are going to be a little weak, and 1 of them is going to do a little better. But I guess you'd have to say, looking at the key industries, it's not that supportive of growth. Again, particularly because agriculture, while it seems to have bottomed out, may not contribute to that much growth in the state other than in the food processing sector. So that's a little bit of a caution for the Nebraska economic outlook. But let's look at some of the other important sectors of our economy. First of all, construction. Certainly we have an urban-rural divide. A lot of the strongest growth will be in the residential and commercial sectors in Omaha and Lincoln, rather than rural areas. Again, I'll cite that struggling farm sector. But there will be good growth in construction. You'll see some results in a minute. There's enough new activity in Omaha and Lincoln to drive a good number in terms of statewide job growth in construction. Manufacturing is a real bright spot. We write in our Outlook report that manufacturing is as strong as it's been in the last decade, since before the Great Recession started. Pretty broad-based growth in manufacturing. We're expecting much stronger job growth than you would expect this late in the business cycle. The growth in most sectors, including machinery manufacturing and transportation equipment. And as I said earlier, Really good conditions for growth in ag processing jobs, animal slaughtering facilities. Of course, you know about the new facility that's going to come online in Fremont, Nebraska in 2019, but there's been many smaller facilities located in the state, expansion of existing facilities. So a lot of good news in food processing. The farm incomes may not be good, but the output of Nebraska farms continues to grow, and there's opportunities to process those agricultural goods. Okay, here's the outlook for construction. You can see 3,200 new jobs expected to be added between 2017 and 2020. So good growth there. Here's manufacturing, 2,800 jobs expected to be added over the next 3 years. Manufacturing employment by 2020 might almost get back to the peak, or I wouldn't call it the peak, I guess, but the level that it was at in 2008. So we may end up getting most, if not all, of our jobs back that we lost in the Great Recession here in Nebraska. Again, partly because of the expansion of that food processing sector. So a good outlook for our industrial sectors, manufacturing, employment. Unfortunately, not agriculture as much, but manufacturing and construction adding about 6,000 new jobs altogether over the next 3 years. Okay, time for our poll question. Will Nebraska taxable sales grow faster or slower than non-farm personal income? So we know that tax revenue growth has been an issue in Nebraska. That's partly sales tax, that's partly personal and business income taxes, or personal and corporate income taxes. What's the outlook for sales taxes, taxable sales, the sales tax base? Will it grow faster or slower than non-farm personal income over the next 3 years? That's our poll question. Do you think it'll grow faster? Do you think it'll grow slower? Or will it depend on the year? Faster some years, slower on others. You'll have a little bit more time to answer this poll question, and go ahead and think about your answer and put it in. Okay, so we've talked about our 3 key industries. We've talked about manufacturing and construction. Let's talk about a few other large employment sectors. Services, that's a very broad-based sector that includes healthcare. It includes business and professional services, leisure and hospitality, personal service like haircuts and car repair. So that's all in the services sector. Well, we're expecting broad-based growth in this sector. The big 3 components of this sector, healthcare, business services, and leisure and hospitality, which includes restaurants, are all expected to grow by more than 1% a year. So good growth in the services sector. A little bit different scenario for retail trade, your retail stores. We expect limited job growth in this sector due to growing online competition. We all know about that. Labor-saving investments at the retailers, so expect more of those self-checkout lines in the coming 3 years. And we've seen, just in 2018, a number of department store closures have been announced in our state, and that's obviously a challenge for employment growth as well. So limited job growth in retail trade, especially in 2018. All right, let's look at the specific forecast. You see retail trade employment here, no job growth in 2018, and only 900 jobs altogether over the next 3 years. And for an industry that already has 109,000 employees, that's not much job growth. In terms of the service sector, that's expected to add between, I believe it's 4,600 and 6,000 jobs per year over the next 3 years. So the service sector, that large sector that included healthcare, business services, leisure and hospitality, a few other things, that'll account for more than half of our Nebraska job growth over the next 3 years. Okay, let's look at the bottom line, total non-farm employment. How is that going to grow in Nebraska? How is it going to grow relative to the U.S.? We are forecasting that Nebraska's job growth rate will lag the U.S. job growth rate over the next 3 years. Again, we got some positive signs in our economy, but some of our key sectors, such as agriculture, transportation, are going to be in limited growth mode, or perhaps even flat over the next 3 years. The other thing is we had really poor job growth in 2017 when the revised employment estimates came out. So 2018, the job growth in Nebraska we think will re-accelerate, but it's hard to re-accelerate up to top speed. So that'll limit job growth rates for 2018 somewhat. Nebraska continues to have a somewhat lower population growth rate than the U.S. This figure is not as bad as it's sometimes talked about. We actually are only about 0.1% per year behind the U.S. growth rate. U.S. might grow at 0.8% a year. Nebraska grows at around 0.7. It's not bad, but it does lag a little bit. Nebraska has fewer pockets of underutilized labor. Our unemployment rate's been low for a very long time. The U.S. has just recently developed a low full unemployment rate, and there's still pockets of the country where there's some unutilized labor to be drawn on. So that helps U.S. job growth a little bit. And then we talked about agriculture not being able to contribute much to growth in Nebraska over the next 3 years. So for all 3 years, for all those reasons, we expect Nebraska job growth to be a little slower, especially in 2018 as Nebraska reaccelerates, as we have some of those challenges in the retail employment, and as the U.S. economy uses up its remaining pockets of underutilized labor. Things close up a little bit in 2019. We expect Nebraska to grow at 0.3% less than the U.S. By 2020, Nebraska will almost have caught up. Again, 1/10 slower because our population growth is expected to be 1/10 slower than the U.S. So we have a good outlook, 0.8 or all the way up to 1% per year. That's 8,000 to 10,000 jobs a year. That's not a bad situation here in Nebraska, but a little less rapid than U.S. growth on a percentage basis. There's that service sector employment. You can see we're going to add 16,600 jobs cumulatively over the next 3 years. Okay, so not a bad job outlook. What about the other key measures of growth in the Nebraska economy, in particular population and income growth? Well, we do think that population growth, as I said, will slightly lag U.S. growth, maybe 1/10% slower. Nebraska fully benefits from international immigration now. We get a slightly lower but a similar rate of international immigration as a lot of states. We do continue to lose when it comes to domestic migration. More people migrate from Nebraska to other U.S. states than other U.S. states to Nebraska, so that hurts our population growth. On the other hand, we have faster population growth because historically and to this day, Nebraska has higher birth rates than a lot of states. It's a good state to raise a family. So our natural population growth is more positive than in a lot of places in the country. So you add all that up and we're about 0.1% behind in terms of our population growth rate here in Nebraska. In terms of income growth, we think it'll be good. About half of our income growth will be due to rising real hourly wages, and about half will be due to more jobs and hours. Okay, so before I present the final numbers in terms of the outlook for population and income, let's go ahead and look at the answer to our second poll question. Will Nebraska taxable sales grow faster or slower than non-farm personal income? Looks like it was about a third in the answers. I guess most people said taxable sales will grow faster, but almost as large a share said slower, and about a quarter of people said it depends on the year. So let's look at the results. You can see that in 2018, taxable sales will grow a little faster than personal income. That's partly because Nebraska's had lagging taxable sales in recent years and we're sort of catching up, but we also have some big projects that are generating new sales tax revenue, like the Facebook project in Sarpy County. So we think taxable sales will exceed non-farm personal income in 2018. But in 2019 and 2020, it will lag a little bit. So the answer, I guess, to the poll question is it depends on the year. But, you know, if you said faster or slower, you were partly right, too. So I give the webinar participants a thumbs up, a good job answering the second poll question. Now, why do we see the results we do for 2019 and 2020? Why do taxable sales lag income growth? I'd say that's more of a typical result that you'll see most years. And the reason is, as incomes grow in the U.S., and because not all consumer spending is subject to the sales tax. You know, when when we pay healthcare costs, with a number of other services, there's no sales tax attached. So it turns out that over time, Americans are spending, and Nebraskans are spending a growing share of their income on services that are not subject to sales tax. So as a result, taxable sales typically grows a little slower than non-farm personal income, and we see that in 2019 and 2020. The other part of it, I suppose, is that farm income also contributes to taxable sales, and we're not expecting farm income growth during the period. Okay, last point I'd like to make is that I think the non-farm personal income numbers look pretty good, especially relative to our expectations about inflation, consumer price index, CPI growth, and population. So take a look at 2018. We're expecting prices to rise by about 2%, population to rise by 0.7%. So you add that together, 2.7% increase in income would be expected just based on inflation and population growth. But what we're actually getting is 3.8%. So that's real per capita personal income growth. Similar picture in 2019 and 2020. And this kind of gets back to the beginning of the webinar. Real income growth is helping a self-sustaining recovery in the Nebraska economy and the U.S. economy, and we're expecting that to continue through 2020. So that is our main report here in terms of our outlook for the Nebraska economy. Now I'd like to answer any questions you may have. No questions at the moment, but we will give you a little time here to see if anyone has a question they would like to ask. I'll go ahead and continue while people are doing that. First of all, this, as I said at the beginning, this is our last webinar for the spring semester here at UNL. I know the spring semester's been over a while, but this is our last webinar. But when school starts again in August, we'll shortly thereafter begin our webinar series again. We'll have 4 webinars in the fall, September, October, November, and December. So please, we'll be sending you announcements. Please join us again in September for those webinars. And please, in the meantime, also follow the Bureau of Business Research on social media. You can see our various social media addresses there. You can also subscribe to our newsletter. It comes out 2-3 times a month. And you just receive an email and a link to a study, which you can look at if you have the time, or delete if you don't have the time. And just send your preferred email address to bbr@unl.edu. And we'll add you to our email list. Well, I appreciate everyone participating in the webinar. Oh, I did see one question. How much of the sales increase will be debt rather than income financed? Well, there is a lot of, that's a good question. There is a lot of confidence in the economy right now. And so I would, there's been a lot of growth in asset values, whether it's the value of people's homes, whether it's the value of their stock portfolio. Not everyone has a stock portfolio, but a significant share of people do. And so a combination of those rising asset values and increased confidence does encourage people to maybe increase their spending a little faster than their income is increasing. So that's an excellent question from Senator Schumacher. And it could be that some of that sales growth is going to be debt finance. But as I indicated, I think there's also reason to expect decent income growth as well. So I think the good news is a significant portion of the sales increase will be supported by real income growth. Well, not seeing any other questions, I'll go ahead and sign off. I appreciate everyone taking the time to join us here over the noon hour. And feel free to contact the Bureau if you have any follow-up questions, or me, and we'd be happy to talk to you. We certainly appreciate your interest in the Nebraska economy. Thanks again for your time. We hope to see you at some of our fall semester webinars.